In the fall of 1982, a sudden wave of fear spread across the United States, beginning in the suburbs of Chicago. It started quietly, almost unnoticeably, with what seemed to be ordinary medical complaints, headaches, colds, or the kind of discomfort that anyone might treat with an over-the-counter pain reliever. Families purchased Tylenol, a trusted household name that had dominated the market for years as a reliable cure for pain. Johnson & Johnson, the parent company of McNeil Consumer Products, had built Tylenol into one of the most recognizable and respected brands in America. But by the first days of October 1982, the brand would become linked forever to one of the most shocking unsolved crimes in U.S. history, a case that would change medicine, marketing, and consumer safety forever. On the morning of September 29, 1982, a 12-year-old girl named Mary Kellerman woke up with a sore throat and runny nose. She was from the suburb of Elk Grove Village, Illinois, a safe community outside of Chicago where neighbors knew each other and life felt secure. Like millions of parents had done before, her father handed her a capsule of extra-strength Tylenol to help ease her discomfort before school. Within hours, tragedy struck. Mary collapsed suddenly in her family's bathroom. Despite immediate medical attention and frantic efforts by doctors, she could not be saved. The cause of her death was at first a mystery, leaving her devastated parents in shock. They had no idea that the seemingly harmless capsule of Tylenol had been laced with potassium cyanide, a lethal poison that had entered her bloodstream and shut down her body. Later that same day, tragedy struck again in the Chicago area. Adam Janus, a 27-year-old postal worker living in Arlington Heights, had taken a Tylenol capsule to relieve minor chest pain. Soon afterward, he collapsed and was rushed to the hospital. Doctors initially suspected a heart attack, but their efforts to stabilize him failed. His death, sudden and unexplained, seemed at first like a personal tragedy. But the connection between his case and Mary Kellerman's would soon become chillingly clear. Even more horrifying was what happened next. After Adam's death, his family gathered at his home to grieve. His brother Stanley and Stanley's wife Teresa were overwhelmed by shock and sorrow. In the midst of grief, they each took capsules of Tylenol from the same bottle that Adam had used earlier. Within minutes, both collapsed in agony, poisoned by the same invisible killer that had taken Adam's life. Emergency responders rushed them to the hospital, but it was too late. Stanley and Teresa died shortly afterward, leaving the Janus family shattered and the medical staff in disbelief. A family that had gathered to mourn one loss was now enduring three within hours, all linked by the same bottle of Tylenol. By the end of September 29th, 5 people were dead across Chicago's suburbs. Mary Kellerman in Elk Grove Village, Adam Janus in Arlington Heights, Stanley and Teresa Janus also in Arlington Heights, and Mary McFarland, a 31-year-old from Lombard who had also taken Tylenol to ease a headache during her workday at a phone company. Each case appeared sudden, shocking, and without warning. The only common thread among them was the presence of Tylenol capsules. Investigators and doctors quickly began to connect the dots, realizing that something sinister was happening. Ordinary bottles of medication, trusted by millions, had been turned into instruments of death. The scale of the crisis deepened when another victim, 35-year-old Paula Prince, a United Airlines flight attendant, was found dead in her Chicago apartment. She had been discovered with an open bottle of Tylenol on her nightstand. Surveillance footage later showed her purchasing the capsules at a Walgreens store the night before. The image of her leaving the store, unaware that she was carrying a fatal poison into her home, became one of the haunting symbols of the tragedy. In total, 7 people died within a matter of days, all from cyanide-laced Tylenol capsules. What had begun as isolated tragedies now revealed itself as a calculated, cold-blooded act of tampering that placed the entire American public at risk. The cyanide used in the murders was powerful enough to kill within minutes. It had been inserted into the capsules after they left the manufacturer, during distribution, or while sitting on store shelves. Authorities quickly concluded that the contamination was not the result of a factory accident or error, but rather a deliberate act by someone who had gained access to the bottles, opened them, replaced capsules with poisoned ones, and resealed the containers to look untouched. The act was terrifying in its simplicity. Anyone could have been next. The idea that a trusted, everyday product could be weaponized created mass panic across the country. People rushed to throw away bottles of Tylenol. Hospitals and police stations set up collection points for capsules, and sales of the once beloved pain reliever plummeted overnight. The media covered the crisis around the clock. broadcasting images of police carrying out bottles of Tylenol, families mourning victims, and stern warnings from health officials. The story spread from Chicago to every corner of the United States, igniting fear that similar poisonings might occur elsewhere. Supermarkets, pharmacies, and corner stores stripped shelves of Tylenol products. At Johnson & Johnson headquarters, executives scrambled to respond to the catastrophe. The company faced not only a public relations nightmare, but also an unprecedented consumer safety crisis. Their brand, trusted for decades, was now associated with fear and death. The very name Tylenol had become toxic. Law enforcement agencies at every level became involved. The FBI, the Food and Drug Administration, and local police worked together in a desperate attempt to identify who had poisoned the capsules and why. Hundreds of investigators combed through stores, warehouses, and supply chains, while others fielded thousands of tips from the public. Forensic scientists studied the capsules, determining that the cyanide levels were incredibly high enough to kill instantly. They concluded that the killer had targeted random bottles on store shelves in the Chicago area, inserting deadly capsules into them. The randomness of the act made it all the more frightening. Unlike other crimes, there was no clear motive, no specific target. Anyone, anywhere could have been a victim simply by treating a headache or cold. As the days unfolded, theories began to circulate. Some believed it was an act of terrorism or revenge. Others speculated that it was the work of a disgruntled employee, a competitor, or even a lone madman seeking attention. The truth remained elusive. Investigators focused on the possibility that the killer had chosen Chicago because it was a major distribution hub, or perhaps simply because it was where they lived and had access to the stores. Whatever the reason, the impact was catastrophic. Johnson & Johnson issued an unprecedented recall of 31 million bottles of Tylenol capsules, pulling every bottle off shelves nationwide. The cost of the recall reached more than $100 million, but the decision ultimately helped rebuild public trust. For many Americans, the recall was a sign that the company put safety ahead of profit, a move that later became a textbook example of crisis management. The deaths also sparked an urgent discussion about consumer safety. At the time, over-the-counter medications were packaged in relatively simple bottles with cotton plugs and basic lids. There were no tamper-evident seals, blister packs, or shrink wrapping that are common today. The Tylenol Murders changed that forever. In the months and years that followed, federal laws were passed requiring tamper-resistant packaging on all medications and many other consumer goods. The Food and Drug Administration introduced new regulations mandating safety seals, foil coverings, and blister packs that would reveal any attempt at tampering. The murders had exposed a shocking vulnerability in the way products were sold, and the government acted swiftly to close that gap. Despite massive efforts, the person responsible for the Tylenol murders was never identified. The case remains unsolved to this day, one of the most notorious criminal mysteries in American history. Over the years, a few suspects came into focus, including a man named James Lewis, who was convicted of extortion after sending a letter to Johnson & Johnson demanding $1 million to stop the killings. Although he was never charged with the murders themselves, his name became permanently linked to the case. Investigators pursued countless leads, but no one was ever convicted for the actual poisonings. The uncertainty left families of the victims without closure, and the public with lingering unease. The idea that a killer could tamper with a common household product, kill 7 people, and vanish without accountability has haunted generations ever since. The days following the discovery of cyanide in Tylenol capsules were marked by mounting hysteria across Chicago and beyond. Residents who had trusted the familiar red and white boxes of extra-strength Tylenol were now treating them as deadly objects. Pharmacies removed every bottle from their shelves, often stacking them in bins and waiting for police to arrive. Hospitals set up special phone lines for panicked callers who wanted to know whether it was safe to take their medicine. Ambulances responded to false alarms when people, frightened after swallowing a pill, became convinced they were poisoned. The fear was contagious, spreading faster than the facts could keep up. The very act of taking something as simple as a pain reliever had become a gamble with life and death. Authorities were under enormous pressure to act quickly. The Cook County Medical Examiner's Office, led by Dr. Thomas Kim, was one of the first to identify cyanide as the cause of the deaths. Once that connection was made, the medical examiner ordered doctors and hospitals to immediately report any unexplained sudden deaths, fearing that there might be more victims who had not yet been linked to the contaminated Tylenol. The Centers for Disease Control sent specialists to Chicago to monitor the situation and evaluate whether the poisonings might be spreading beyond Illinois. Meanwhile, law enforcement officials had to confront the terrifying possibility that more bottles were still out there, sitting unnoticed on store shelves, waiting for another unsuspecting consumer. The scope of the investigation quickly grew. The FBI launched what would become one of the largest product tampering investigations in U.S. history. More than 1,000 agents and local police officers were tasked with visiting every store that carried Tylenol, inspecting shelves and seizing capsules for testing. By the end of the first week, more than 1,500 police officers were working around the clock in the Chicago area alone. They went door to door, warning families and asking for any Tylenol to be turned in. Helicopters hovered over neighborhoods, broadcasting messages through loudspeakers. It was a scene that felt more like a wartime mobilization than a consumer product investigation, but the danger was very real. The bottles were indistinguishable from safe ones until they were opened and tested, and every household seemed vulnerable. As the investigation widened, reporters swarmed the Chicago suburbs, covering every development with intensity. Newspapers carried grim headlines, television anchors opened nightly broadcasts with updates on the case, and images of Tylenol bottles became symbols of fear. For Johnson & Johnson, the crisis was nothing short of catastrophic. Tylenol was not just a product. It was the company's most profitable brand, accounting for more than one-third of its revenues. By the first week of October, Tylenol sales had collapsed almost entirely, dropping from a market share of 37% to less than 8%. Competing pain relievers like aspirin and ibuprofen surged in popularity as terrified consumers abandoned Tylenol altogether. Analysts predicted that the brand might never recover, and some speculated that Johnson & Johnson could even be forced out of the over-the-counter market altogether. Despite the commercial disaster, Johnson & Johnson made a series of bold moves that would later be studied as a textbook case of crisis management. Under the leadership of CEO James Burke, the company made the decision to recall every single Tylenol capsule product nationwide, 31 million bottles in total. This was unprecedented at the time, not just in scale but in cost. The recall alone was valued at more than $100 million, but Burke and his executives insisted that no financial calculation could outweigh the trust and safety of consumers. They launched a media campaign, warning the public not to consume Tylenol capsules and offering refunds or exchanges. In the process, Johnson & Johnson made consumer safety their top priority, even when it threatened the survival of their most valuable brand. On the investigative front, authorities were struggling to identify suspects. The randomness of the attacks made profiling extremely difficult. There was no clear victim type, no personal connection between the dead, and no apparent motive. The killer seemed to have chosen Tylenol as a vehicle for mass terror rather than targeting individuals. Investigators worked through thousands of tips, interviewing store employees, delivery drivers, warehouse workers, and anyone who might have had access to the bottles before they reached consumers. Forensic teams tried to trace the poisoned capsules back through the distribution chain, but the tampering had almost certainly occurred at the retail level. The killer had likely taken bottles from store shelves, inserted poisoned capsules, and then placed them back for unsuspecting buyers to purchase. It was a crime that required minimal resources yet created maximum chaos. As panic spread nationwide, the federal government moved quickly to address the larger issue of consumer safety. Congress passed the Tylenol bill, officially known as the Federal Anti-Tampering Act, in 1983. The law made it a federal crime to tamper with consumer products, punishable by up to life in prison. The legislation was designed not only to deter future acts of product tampering, but also to give federal authorities greater jurisdiction over such cases. At the same time, the Food and Drug Administration introduced sweeping new packaging requirements, mandating tamper-resistant features for all over-the-counter medications. This included foil seals, glued boxes, and other packaging methods that made it immediately obvious if a product had been opened. Before the Tylenol murders, such measures were uncommon. Afterward, they became standard practice around the world. Meanwhile, investigators zeroed in on a suspect whose name would forever be tied to the case, James William Lewis. Lewis, a 36-year-old man with a troubled history, became a person of interest after Johnson & Johnson received a handwritten extortion letter demanding $1 million to stop the killings. The letter, postmarked from Chicago, was quickly traced back to Lewis, who was living in New York at the time. The FBI arrested him in December 1982 and charged him with extortion. He was later convicted and sentenced to 20 years in prison. However, despite extensive questioning, no evidence ever directly linked him to the actual poisonings. Lewis maintained that he had written the letter as part of an elaborate scheme to frame his former employer, whom he claimed owed him money. While many investigators believed he had knowledge of the crimes, prosecutors could not prove that he had planted the cyanide-laced capsules. The inability to convict Lewis of the murders left the case unresolved, but it did not stop public speculation. Over the years, he became the most notorious figure associated with the Tylenol murders, his name appearing in countless news stories and documentaries. For the families of the victims, however, the lack of closure was devastating. They had lost loved ones in sudden, horrific fashion, and decades later they still had no definitive answers. Each anniversary of the murders brought renewed media attention and fresh reminders of their grief. Law enforcement continued to keep the case open, reviewing new leads as they emerged, but the identity of the person who actually poisoned the capsules has never been confirmed. The Tylenol murders left scars not only on the families of the victims, but also on the psyche of the nation. For many Americans, it was the first time they realized that everyday products could be turned into instruments of terror. Unlike other crimes, which often felt distant or avoidable, this one struck at the heart of daily life. Anyone could be a victim simply by taking a pill for a headache. The randomness of the crime made it unforgettable, and it permanently changed the way people thought about consumer safety. For Johnson & Johnson, the road to recovery was long, but eventually, the company's bold recall and new safety measures helped restore trust. Within a year, Tylenol had regained a significant share of the market, and in time, it would once again become the top-selling pain reliever in America. The brand's survival was seen as a testament to the power of transparency and responsibility in the face of crisis. Still, questions remained. Who was behind the poisonings? Why did they do it? Were there other bottles that had never been discovered? Could the same thing happen again? These questions lingered long after the immediate panic faded. The Tylenol murders were more than just a crime. They were a national trauma, a collective reminder of vulnerability in a world that felt increasingly unpredictable. Each victim, Mary Kellerman, Adam Janus, Stanley and Teresa Janus, Mary McFarland, Paula Prince, and Mary Reiner became symbols of that trauma. Their lives, cut short by a cruel and faceless act, were remembered not only by their families, but by millions of strangers who mourned the loss and shared in the fear. As investigators continued to sift through leads, another element of the case began to emerge: the possibility of copycats. In the months following the Chicago poisonings, dozens of reports surfaced of product tampering across the country. Some were hoaxes, others genuine cases of contamination. Police departments from coast to coast were suddenly dealing with threats to food, beverages, and household goods. The Tylenol murders had not only terrified consumers, but also inspired others to exploit the same vulnerabilities. For a time, it seemed as though no product on a store shelf could be trusted. The ripple effect of the crimes was massive, creating a sense of paranoia that extended far beyond Illinois. Even as new regulations were put in place, the fear of tampering lingered in the public imagination. By the mid-1980s, the Tylenol case had entered the realm of legend, a cautionary tale told in classrooms, boardrooms, and law enforcement training programs. It reshaped corporate responsibility, public health policy, and consumer awareness. Yet at its core, it remained an unsolved mystery, a chilling reminder of how one individual's act of malice could destabilize an entire society. For the investigators who had worked the case, the lack of resolution was frustrating, even haunting. They had interviewed thousands of people, followed countless leads, and pored over every shred of forensic evidence, but the killer's identity continued to elude them. In the end, the Tylenol murders were less about answers and more about questions that still echo decades later. Whenever someone twists open a bottle and wonders even briefly whether the seal has been broken. As the days turned into weeks after the first deaths, the Chicago area was transformed into the center of one of the most intense investigations in modern American history. The FBI, the Food and Drug Administration, and local law enforcement worked tirelessly, setting up command posts and flooding the suburbs with agents. They searched warehouses, distribution centers, and stores, trying to determine how cyanide capsules had slipped into the supply chain. It quickly became clear that the tampering was not an inside job at the manufacturing plants. The capsules had been fine when they left McNeil Consumer Products, the Johnson & Johnson subsidiary that produced Tylenol. Somewhere between production and purchase, someone had slipped cyanide-laced capsules into random bottles. The realization that the killer had likely walked into ordinary drugstores, opened bottles, filled capsules with poison, and put them back on shelves left authorities stunned. The act was both horrifyingly simple and devastatingly effective. Investigators mapped the locations of the deaths and discovered that the contaminated bottles had been purchased from a handful of stores in the Chicago metropolitan area. The fact that the poisonings were concentrated there suggested that the killer either lived locally or specifically targeted the region. FBI profilers began sketching out the possible psychology of such a person. They believed the perpetrator might be someone with knowledge of chemicals, access to cyanide, and the ability to manipulate capsules without drawing attention. At the same time, they considered the possibility of an extortionist, someone who wanted to paralyze Johnson & Johnson and profit from fear. But every theory met roadblocks. No one who fit the psychological profile could be conclusively tied to the crime scenes. Forensic testing confirmed that the cyanide concentrations were extraordinarily high. Each tainted capsule contained enough poison to kill multiple people. Whoever prepared them had not been subtle. They had packed the capsules with a lethal dose far beyond what was necessary. Some experts speculated that the killer wanted the deaths to be rapid and unmistakable, ensuring maximum terror and media attention. The medical examiner's findings supported this theory, noting that victims had collapsed within minutes of ingestion. It was as if the killer wanted the capsules to act as a weapon of shock, spreading fear far faster than the poison itself. As Johnson & Johnson recalled millions of bottles, the company also faced questions from angry consumers and lawmakers. Why had capsules been so easy to tamper with? Why had there been no safety seals or packaging to protect the public? The truth was that before 1982, such precautions were simply not part of standard practice. Products were sold with basic screw-top lids, and the idea of tampering was rarely considered. The Tylenol Murders forced the entire pharmaceutical industry to confront vulnerabilities that had always existed but had never been exploited on such a scale. Almost overnight, packaging practices began to change. Shrink-wrap seals, foil linings, and plastic barriers were introduced not just for medications but for food, beverages, and household goods. What had once been an afterthought became a priority, all because of 7 deaths in Chicago. Meanwhile, law enforcement focused heavily on James William Lewis, the man who had sent the extortion letter to Johnson & Johnson. He had demanded $1 million to stop the killings, writing with chilling certainty about Tylenol's contamination. Authorities believed he had knowledge that only the killer could possess. When they tracked him down in New York, he insisted that the letter was nothing more than a hoax, a twisted scheme to frame a former employer who he claimed had wronged him financially. Lewis had a long criminal history, including fraud and accusations of violence, making him an easy suspect to latch onto. The FBI poured resources into his background, convinced they had their man. But despite years of investigation, no evidence directly linked him to the cyanide bottles. All they could prove was extortion, for which he was sentenced to prison. Even with Lewis behind bars, the sense of unease did not fade. Many investigators privately believed he was connected to the murders, perhaps as the mastermind if not the direct poisoner. But the lack of physical evidence meant the case remained officially unsolved. The uncertainty only deepened the mystery. Families of the victims were left with the unbearable reality that justice might never come. For the Kellermans, the Janus family, the McFarlands, and the others, every news broadcast was a reminder of lives stolen in an instant. Each anniversary brought new interviews, new documentaries, and new promises from police to continue pursuing leads. Yet the killer had seemingly vanished, leaving behind nothing but fear and questions. The ripple effects extended beyond Illinois. Across the nation, police departments began receiving reports of suspected product tampering. Some were genuine, while many were hoaxes. Grocers, pharmacists, and retailers became hypervigilant, inspecting shelves daily. Parents warned their children never to open a product if the seal was broken. Even candy and soda manufacturers began redesigning their packaging. The public had been taught a lesson it would never forget. The everyday act of buying something off the shelf carried risks that no one had previously considered. This fear altered shopping habits for years, and in some ways, the paranoia never fully disappeared. In Chicago, the sense of violation was particularly strong. The murders had struck at the heart of ordinary neighborhoods, quiet suburbs where people had believed they were safe. Residents of Elk Grove Village, Arlington Heights, Lombard, and other affected areas were forever marked by the knowledge that their communities had been chosen, seemingly at random, for an act of terror. Schools, churches, and local organizations held vigils for the victims, with thousands attending to grieve and demand justice. Local law enforcement officers, many of whom had lived in these neighborhoods their entire lives, felt a personal stake in solving the crime. Yet, no matter how hard they tried, the trail always seemed to go cold. The FBI released sketches and conducted interviews on television, urging anyone with information to come forward. They even considered the possibility of multiple perpetrators, given the logistical difficulty of tampering with so many bottles. Was it a lone individual with time and access, or a small group working together? No answer ever emerged. The case became one of the great frustrations of American criminal history. A crime with devastating consequences, a clear method of attack, but no identifiable suspect. For Johnson & Johnson, the path to redemption came through transparency. They invited reporters into their facilities, showed the public the steps they were taking to make products safer, and launched new packaging innovations. Their decision to replace capsules with caplets, which were far harder to tamper with, demonstrated a commitment to consumer trust. By late 1983, Tylenol was regaining market share. Within a few years, it had fully recovered, proving that honesty and accountability could rebuild even the most damaged brand. Business schools began teaching the Tylenol recall as a case study in crisis management, citing it as an example of how corporations should act in the face of tragedy. Yet beneath the business recovery, the human cost remained. Each victim's story echoed through the community. Mary Kellerman, just 12 years old, had been a bright and cheerful girl whose life was cut short before it had truly begun. Adam Janus, the postal worker, was remembered as a loving husband and brother, whose family was shattered not once but 3 times in a single day. Stanley and Teresa Janus left behind loved ones who struggled with the unthinkable cruelty of losing so many in such a short time. Paula Prince, the flight attendant, became a haunting symbol after security cameras captured her last moments buying the very bottle that would kill her. These faces, these names, became forever tied to the tragedy, reminding the nation that the story was not about a brand or a company, but about real lives stolen without warning. As the first anniversary approached in 1983, families gathered again to mourn. The media returned and reporters asked the same unanswered question: who had done this and why? Police admitted they were no closer to solving the case than they had been in those chaotic first days. The lack of closure weighed heavily, and for many it still does decades later. The Tylenol murders remain one of the most haunting unsolved mysteries in American history, a crime that reshaped society but never gave up its secrets. By the time the second anniversary of the Tylenol murders arrived in 1984, the Chicago area was still struggling to understand how such a crime could have been carried out in plain sight and yet remain unsolved. Despite thousands of interviews, extensive forensic testing, and the full weight of federal and local resources, the investigation remained stalled. Investigators had long since concluded that the poisonings were random, that the killer had no personal connection to the victims, and that the bottles had been tampered with on store shelves. But knowing the method did not bring them closer to the person behind it. The lack of fingerprints, witnesses, or surveillance footage in an era before modern cameras made the case staggeringly difficult. Each empty lead seemed to push the truth further away, and the passage of time only deepened the mystery. The spotlight remained firmly on James William Lewis. Even though he had been convicted only of extortion, he continued to attract media attention as the most likely suspect in the public eye. From prison, he often courted notoriety, granting interviews and issuing statements that kept his name in circulation. His writings and letters displayed a strange mixture of intelligence and menace, reinforcing the idea that he was capable of devising such a crime. Yet the absence of physical evidence tying him to the cyanide-laced capsules made prosecutors cautious. To many, he embodied the frustration of the entire case, a man who fit the profile in so many ways, yet who could not be definitively linked to the murders. For the families of the victims, this uncertainty was unbearable. They gathered at vigils, spoke with reporters, and pleaded with investigators to keep pressing forward. Parents like the Kellermans faced each anniversary with grief as fresh as the day their child died. For the Janus family, who had endured the loss of 3 relatives in one day, the pain was compounded by the sense of injustice. They could not understand how, with so much attention and so many resources, the murderer could remain free. Each passing year added a new layer of anguish. The families were trapped in a cycle of public remembrance without resolution. Their loved ones' names invoked in headlines, but their killer never found. Meanwhile, Johnson & Johnson continued its campaign to rebuild trust. The company rolled out tamper-evident packaging across all its products, not only Tylenol. Shrink-wrap seals, glued boxes, and foil coverings became a new industry standard. The company also shifted from capsules, which could be easily opened and resealed, to solid caplets that were more resistant to tampering. These innovations reassured consumers, and by 1984, Tylenol was once again a top seller in American households. Business leaders and marketing experts pointed to the Tylenol case as proof that transparency and accountability could save a brand even after an unimaginable crisis. Yet, while the corporation recovered, the haunting reality of 7 lives lost remained at the center of the story. The murders also sparked a wave of copycat crimes and hoaxes. In the months and years that followed, police across the country received hundreds of reports of suspected tampering. Some were pranks meant to cause panic, while others were genuine attempts to harm. Candy, baby food, and other consumer products became targets. In some cases, objects like needles or glass were found hidden inside food packages. Although most incidents were isolated and did not result in fatalities, they amplified public fear and kept the memory of the Tylenol killings alive. Supermarkets began investing in more secure packaging and more rigorous inspections. Families learned to check seals and lids before consuming anything, a habit that endures to this day. The Tylenol murders had permanently reshaped consumer behavior. Despite the efforts to strengthen safety, the central question of the original crime remained unanswered. Who had killed 7 innocent people in Chicago and why? Over the decades, investigators chased countless leads. They explored the possibility of disgruntled employees, corporate sabotage, terrorism, and personal vendettas. They considered whether someone with access to cyanide, such as a chemist, lab worker, or industrial employee, might have carried out the crime. They analyzed patterns of purchase, studied handwriting samples, and examined the chemistry of the capsules. Every promising lead seemed to dissolve under scrutiny, leaving the case cold. In the 1990s, advances in forensic science sparked renewed hope. DNA testing and improved fingerprint technology gave investigators new tools to examine old evidence. Police exhumed some of the victims' remains to conduct fresh tests for cyanide levels, hoping to uncover new details about the capsule's composition or the method of tampering. The FBI revisited its files, re-interviewed witnesses, and tested evidence with the latest techniques. But once again, no definitive breakthrough emerged. The killer had either been extraordinarily careful or extraordinarily lucky, leaving behind no usable trace. The idea that someone could commit such a crime, devastate an entire nation, and then disappear without consequence seemed almost unbelievable. The impact of the murders lingered in subtle ways. Every time a consumer tore off a foil seal or peeled back shrink wrap, they were participating in a ritual born of that tragedy. Every product tampering scare that followed, from Halloween candy scares to later incidents involving food and beverages, drew immediate comparisons to Chicago in 1982. The Tylenol case became shorthand for vulnerability in consumer culture, a reminder that safety could never be taken for granted. In boardrooms, government agencies, and homes alike, the phrase, "the Tylenol murders," carried the weight of a cautionary tale. By the early 2000s, attention to the case had faded somewhat, but anniversaries always reignited public interest. Documentaries, news specials, and investigative reports returned to the story, interviewing retired detectives and grieving families. Each time, the narrative was the same: a horrifying crime, a groundbreaking rat call, new safety measures, but no closure. The killer had never been identified. For many, that unresolved ending was the most haunting element of all. The randomness of the victims, the simplicity of the method, and the absence of justice combined to create a sense of unease that persisted across decades. The families, however, never gave up hope. Some continued to work with investigators, others gave interviews to keep the story alive, and many participated in memorials. They wanted the world to remember not just the crime, but the lives behind it. They wanted people to remember Mary Kellerman's innocence, the Janus family's love for one another, the compassion of Mary McFarland, the warmth of Paula Prince, and the strength of Mary Reiner. They wanted the story to be more than a corporate crisis or a criminal mystery. It was, at its core, a story of ordinary people whose lives were stolen without warning, whose deaths reshaped the way a nation thought about trust and safety. By the time 3 decades had passed, the Tylenol murders were firmly embedded in American history. They had become a case study not just in criminal investigation, but in crisis management, consumer safety, and cultural fear. Yet, despite all the analysis, the central mystery remained untouched. The crime had no resolution, no clear motive, and no identified perpetrator. It remained and still remains one of the most chilling unsolved mysteries in modern times. As the years stretched into decades, the Tylenol murders of 1982 never faded from the collective memory of America. For Chicago, the crime remained a scar etched into the history of its suburbs, a chilling reminder that evil could strike at random and turn something as ordinary as a medicine cabinet into a site of terror. For the nation, it stood as the moment that consumer trust was shattered and then rebuilt under entirely new rules. Even as new crimes and scandals dominated headlines in the years that followed, the name Tylenol remained synonymous with the idea of product tampering, a phrase that carried with it both fear and caution. In the 2000s, renewed attention was drawn to the case when the FBI reopened the investigation with the benefit of modern forensic techniques. Agents collected DNA samples from suspects, including James William Lewis, who by then had long since been released from prison after serving his sentence for extortion. They searched his home in Massachusetts, seizing computers and documents, looking for any trace of evidence that might finally connect him to the murders. Investigators even attempted to compare DNA samples to evidence from the original bottles. Yet, despite the exhaustive effort, no conclusive link was found. The renewed investigation captured media attention, reigniting speculation, but once again the trail went cold. Lewis denied involvement until his death in 2023, maintaining that he had been unfairly tied to the case for much of his life. His death closed one chapter but left the larger mystery unresolved. Over the years, other suspects have been considered, but none were ever formally charged. Some theories suggested disgruntled employees within the pharmaceutical or chemical industries. Others pointed to lone actors with access to cyanide and a desire to spread fear. There were whispers of corporate sabotage, revenge, and even domestic terrorism. Yet none of these theories ever yielded proof. The randomness of the crime made it uniquely difficult to solve. The killer did not target a specific person or group. They targeted trust itself. The victims were not chosen for who they were, but for the tragic circumstance of having purchased a poisoned bottle. That randomness meant investigators had little to trace, no motive to pursue, and no clear suspect pool to narrow down. The legacy of the murders is most visible not in the cold case files, but in the everyday habits of consumers around the world. Every time someone twists open a medicine bottle and hears the crack of a safety seal, they're hearing an echo of 1982. Every time someone peels back a foil lining or struggles with shrink-wrap plastic, they are participating in a ritual of protection born from the deaths of 7 strangers in Chicago. The packaging changes mandated in the wake of the murders saved countless lives in the years that followed, preventing similar crimes from being easily repeated. What had once been a vulnerability became a shield, but the cost of that shield was immeasurable grief. The story has been retold in countless formats: documentaries, books, podcasts, and news specials. Each retelling brings with it the faces of the victims, reminding new generations of what was lost. The photographs of Mary Kellerman's youth, the Janus family's devastation, the quiet dignity of Paula Prince, the everyday lives of Mary McFarland and Mary Reiner, all of them are etched into the narrative. Their names are spoken not only as victims but as symbols of how quickly and arbitrarily life can be taken. Their stories continue to move audiences because they represent the vulnerability that every person shares. The fragility of trust in a world where safety can be undone by a single malicious act. For Johnson & Johnson, the murders remain both the darkest chapter in its history and the turning point that demonstrated the power of corporate accountability. The decision to recall 31 million bottles, to risk financial collapse in favor of consumer safety, became a model for crisis management studied around the world. Business leaders point to the case as proof that transparency and prioritizing public welfare can rebuild trust, even after unimaginable tragedy. Tylenol eventually regained its place as a top-selling pain reliever, but it carried forever the association with the crime that nearly destroyed it. For many consumers, the brand name still conjures memories of fear and loss even decades later. The legal landscape of America also shifted permanently. The Federal Anti-Tampering Act of 1983 made product tampering a federal offense, with penalties as severe as life imprisonment. The law expanded federal jurisdiction and allowed the FBI to intervene immediately in any suspected case. It also gave prosecutors new tools to pursue offenders who sought to exploit public fear. These legal changes extended far beyond medicine, covering food, beverages, cosmetics, and countless other consumer goods. What began as a crime in Chicago became the catalyst for national protections that endure to this day. Even with these sweeping changes, the lack of justice for the original victims remains the deepest wound. Each anniversary is a reminder that the killer was never found, that the families of the dead never saw accountability delivered. Law enforcement agencies still list the Tylenol murders as an open case, one of the most infamous unsolved crimes in American history. Retired detectives often speak of it with frustration, recalling the sleepless nights and relentless dead ends that defined their work. Some admit that the case may never be solved, that the truth may have died with the killer or been buried beneath the passage of time. Others hold out hope that a piece of overlooked evidence, a confession, or a breakthrough in forensic science could one day provide answers. The Tylenol murders remain a haunting reminder of how fragile normal life can be. In 1982, families reached for a trusted brand to ease their headaches, their colds, and their minor pains, never imagining that those capsules had been transformed into instruments of death. 7 people lost their lives. A 12-year-old girl with her future ahead of her, a young father and his grieving family, a loving couple taken. Together, a hard-working mother, a devoted flight attendant, and a new mother just beginning her journey. Their stories are remembered not only in the annals of crime but in the everyday lives of people who learn to look twice at what they consume, to trust but verify, to never take safety for granted. More than 4 decades later, the phrase, the Tylenol murders, still resonates with fear, sorrow, and unanswered questions. It is a case that redefined consumer safety, reshaped corporate responsibility, and remains, to this day, one of the most chilling, unsolved mysteries in American history. And until the killer is found or the truth finally comes to light, the story will continue to haunt the edges of American memory, a reminder that even the most ordinary acts can hide extraordinary danger.